Which takes more bravery, staying or leaving? Welcome to Why Are You Here? I'm Michael. Thanks for being here. A friend said something to me recently that stuck out. She said, "We are all where we are because it's where we want to be." At first, that sounded obvious, almost comforting, the easy answer. But the more we talked about it, the more complicated it became. There we were, three of us, all nomads, drinking wine on a Friday night, living the same life, expats. And philosophically, we all agreed with the idea that people make choices, and at some point, we live with them. But we spent nearly an hour trying to figure out how that sentence actually applied to each of us. Now, I've heard that sentence said 1,000 times before in various ways. But that night, that conversation felt different. Maybe it was the wine. Okay, probably the wine. And we started sharing pieces of our own stories. Bad marriages, career decisions, health, relationships. And at some point it hit me. We weren't arguing about who was right or who was wrong. We were talking about the choices we'd made to stay or to leave. From the outside, leaving looks brave. From the inside, staying can feel heavier. So why does staying feel heavy? Sometimes staying stops feeling like we have a choice and starts feeling like inertia. People often stay because of circumstances, not because they want to, but because it feels like there's no other options. And feeling like you don't have options, boy, that's heavy. I have a close friend who is living this right now. She has that nomadic spirit, that pull to explore the world. But her family circumstances forced her into a decision. She went back home to care for a family member who needed full-time support and care. She says she didn't have a choice, that she feels stuck. But from where I stand, she did have a choice. And she chose the harder one. In my eyes, staying was brave. Frankly, I think it's a much braver choice than I could have made. So then, why do we almost always call leaving brave? Maybe because a lot of people are afraid to do exactly that. Culturally, we celebrate leaving. Explorers, astronauts, even truck drivers. People always on the move. Writers like Hemingway built entire myths around leaving. Movement, exile, reinvention. The idea that meaning is found someplace else. My grandfather left his home country at age 19. No money, no plan, not even a direction. He crossed the world because he believed in the adventure of leaving. When I think about why we call leaving brave, I think about stories like his. But that idea that my grandfather was brave, that came from our side of the family, the side that settled in the United States. Years later, I visited his home country. I met distant relatives, my history, and they had a very different reaction. They asked me, why did he leave? Not with admiration, but with confusion. Even 70 years later, they couldn't understand why someone would simply walk away from family, responsibilities, belonging, for what looked like to them for no good reason. In their eyes, he wasn't brave. And that's when something clicked. Bravery really depends on where you're standing. And a lot of people believe that when someone leaves, they're running away from responsibility or obligation. Sometimes that might be true, but it's never that simple. So when someone leaves, I think it's fair to ask, are they running away Or are they running toward something else? And is it ever really just one or the other? Only the person who makes that choice ever really knows. And even then, that answer changes year to year, season to season, place to place. For the people who stayed, it's often hard to understand those who left. That gap can turn into frustration or resentment. Not because anyone is wrong, because the stories just no longer line up anymore. There are very few common themes left. But let's talk about Hollywood for a moment. Now, there are very few movies that actually talk about staying. Perhaps it's just a less interesting story. It sells less tickets. And right now, I can only think of one movie that really glorifies the decision to stay. And even that movie was a box office disaster when it first came out. It's a Wonderful Life. George Bailey spends the whole movie doing the right thing, the responsible thing, the thing everyone told him around him to do. But in his heart, he wants to see the world. And maybe because of the era, maybe because of who I am, I see a little bit of my grandfather's spirit in George Bailey. That same pull, that same longing. But their stories ended very differently. My grandfather left, crossed oceans, built a new life. He eventually met my grandmother in a tea shop in New York City, and the rest was history for my side of the family. But George Bailey, no, he stayed. Out of duty, obligation, responsibility. And the movie, it tells us it all worked out. That George Bailey becomes the richest man on earth. Not in money, but in love, community, and meaning. So what's the right answer? Staying or leaving? I'm not going to pretend to know. But what I do know is there isn't an easier or harder path. Just different ones. Each with rewards, each with sacrifices. And people who never leave home rarely understand those who do. My side of the family still has no idea why I chose to live my life overseas, why I chose this path. But there was one notable exception. Sometimes when I visit home and I'm telling her stories about my life, she'll occasionally look at me and say, "You know, Michael, you have your grandfather's spirit." And then I know she understands. Thank you for being here, especially when you could be someplace else.